Hi, P Seminar, Mr. Muller here, and in this video we're going to talk about, finally, some guidelines on how to write a research project for an argument. Now this is particularly if I'm giving you some sort of essay or writing assignment. How do you go about this in a very professional manner? That's what we're going to be learning about today. In the last videos we talked about how to create a working thesis, how to gather sources, how to evaluate those sources, and now we're finally going to talk about how to write this thing. So hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. Now, before you start to write your assignments, you determine what kind of argument it is, you've gotten your sources together, working thesis, you've got a preliminary outline. Before you write your argument, you should have a working thesis, and you've looked at sources on how to develop that working thesis, and you should have read, you should have evaluated, you should have notes on the source material that you're going to be using to start this assignment. So you've got everything ready to go. Now you're going to type it. Make sure you have that together because your thesis and your sources are going to guide how you write. Do not Leroy Jenkins a situation. Now, the tough thing to think about as you're writing is how much are you going to contribute to this assignment? Because you're going to have all these sources, primary and secondary, you're going to have data, you're going to have quotes from experts. How much is going to be your original work and how heavily are you going to rely on those sources? If you are writing an argument where I'm expecting a lot of source material, I want you to draw on the expertise of others. They have the PhDs, they've done the research, they've dedicated their lives to these topics. So I want you to lean on those expertise, but I want to see that you've synthesized the evidence, that you can analyze it, that you can connect information from multiple sources, that you can draw conclusions. Now, how you can do that is by answering some of these questions down here. And again, think about the roles that you're trying to take as you are researching, a skeptic, analysis, being a contributor. So think about this. Who do you agree or disagree with? You should be citing the entire conversation on this topic, not just the perspective that you agree with. So which do you agree and disagree with, and why? Or what positions do you agree to, but you can add an additional point to? And what original analysis can you actually offer? Looking at all these sources, how can you connect them? How can you explain to your readers how this works as a whole? So think about some of those roles. That's a great way to demonstrate that you've synthesized information and that you've contributed to all of these sources instead of just letting the sources make your argument. One issue that I had with a lot of my US history classes, particularly in the last year, was students would just cite a source, then cite a source, then cite a source, but they're not making any arguments. They're trying to make their sources make the argument instead of doing a synthesis of the information. Now, how do you determine the main points that you're going to have? The reasons that you're going to be including for your claim. Now again, look back over the notes on your sources. Think about how to group the ideas. In an earlier video, what I used to do with my history courses is when I found a topic, I got a research question, I developed a working thesis, and I was reading about all those topics, for instance, Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. I annotated, took notes on all my sources, then I went through them, picked out the most important points. I typed them all out on a Word document, and I made sure I cited the pages and authors of where that's coming from. And then once I had 15 pages of quotes, then I grouped the ideas so that could determine my main points. Now, when you determine those main points, you got to make sure that it's supporting your thesis. If it's not, you need to change your thesis to reflect the information that you have. Because if you're trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole, it's not really going to work. Let your sources dictate your thesis. If you're finding that your sources aren't really supporting that thesis very well, then change the thesis a little bit. Now, after you've got your main points down, create basically a working outline. We already talked about how to do a working outline. I've showed you two different examples of that. And the reason why you do that is so you have everything in your head that you can visualize. Here's how the entire thing is going to work. You can visualize, you can see the paragraphs, you can see the points that you're making. It helps you more organized and it helps you be more efficient as you're writing this assignment. So, let's say you're writing. Let's talk about something a lot of people have an issue with and something that is a big deal, not just in high school, but especially in university. How do you avoid plagiarizing? What is plagiarism? For different things. Of course, you know you're supposed to cite things, but how do you effectively paraphrase? What's the difference between paraphrasing and summarizing? When should you paraphrase? When should you quote? What do you do if you have a really long quote? Now we're going to talk about some of these guidelines. Now, here are things you do not need to cite. If it's a well-known fact that's in multiple sources that people just know because it's a big deal, you don't have to cite that. It's common knowledge. So for instance, you don't have to cite when World War II began because, to be honest, we all know when it began, especially from a European perspective. It's 1939 when Germany invades Poland. Also, you don't have to cite your own research because you are the source for that. Now, you have to say what the survey is or your individual interviews, but you don't have to cite them because it's information that you've done. It's your own field research. Now, to avoid trying to take plagiarism and making sure that everything you put in there is properly cited, when you're creating your working bibliography, and you could do that a lot of different ways, what I do personally is I just type out all my sources on a Word document or a Google Doc and make sure I cite every quote. That way it's already there, I'm not missing anything. Make sure you've got a working bibliography, and any notes that you've taken on these content areas, create a separate file for that. And the reason why is so that you're not confusing a quote with notes or synthesis items that you're writing associated with that quote. If anything is being copied from a source, make sure that as you're getting those together, you're putting parentheses, you're putting in your quotations, you're citing the source. Just do it before you write it, get it all organized so that you're avoiding plagiarism that you didn't necessarily mean to put in. After you've done that, print everything out. What also might be useful is to print out your sources as you're researching, so that way if you need to go back, you're like, shoot, I don't think that's right, you can go back to the source. So make sure your sources are all ready, make sure your working bibliography and the notes on those are separate, make sure in your working bibliography everything is quoted and cited, and make sure that everything's just ready, just in case. What you don't want to do is fall into a situation where you don't quite know if that was the actual page or which author that was. Just take a couple of minutes as you're going through your research, make sure everything's cited. Now, how do you avoid plagiarism when you're particularly quoting? Now, these are things that you know pretty well from your English classes. Honestly, when it comes to writing arguments, a lot of people say, oh, paraphrasing is better than quoting. It's really not. The best way to prove your points when you're using a source is to let the author speak instead of you trying to explain what the author is saying. Now, when you're doing that, make sure you're doing direct quotations. And after that, give me the author's last name and the page number. Now, I always say this too, put the period afterwards. Period comes after the whole thing. I had a professor in college in history who was always like, the period comes after the parentheses. So I'm just emphasizing that to you now. The period comes after the parentheses, then you start your next sentence. If the author's name appears in the sentence before you put the quote in, so if you're telling me that this is coming from this author and this text, and then you put the quote in, you don't need to tell me the author's name again. It's redundant. I know it's what the author is for that quote. Just give me the page number. Now, make sure that if in your quote, there's a quote inside your quote, and sometimes that's a little weird, make sure that whatever's being quoted inside your quote has single quotation marks. They just look like this. So I know that in that quote, the author is citing someone else. And a lot of times that happens, especially in history documents, when the author is citing someone else talking about a historical event. Now, here's something that you may not know. There is a difference between summarizing and paraphrasing. Summarizing is when the entire thing is in your own words. If any words in that entire summary come from a source, they must be quoted. Even if it's just one or two little keywords, they have to be cited. Honestly, it's giving respect to the person who spent years and years of their life trying to investigate this particular subject. Now, I don't recommend summarizing, because it's very dangerous. If you don't do it very, very carefully, you will plagiarize. So if you have to not use quotes, make sure you're paraphrasing. Now, the thing about paraphrasing is I gotta give you the definition here, because sometimes we just don't really know a hard definition. It's representing the idea of the source in your own words. So you're not quoting them. If anything comes from that actual source, you need to quote it. But it's the idea of you're representing the idea in their own words, but you still need to reference it because it's not your idea. It's not original. Give credit where credit is obviously due. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of what a summary is, plagiarism is, and the proper way to, summary, paraphrasing, and a proper way to do this. So take a look at this particular quote. This is a plagiarized paraphrase. Now the reason why is, if you're reading it, I can tell that the wording of the language changes here. You're not giving any credit where credit is due to the author. You can see that the wording here, you can tell it seems like they're almost reading off of something. It just seems too easy. And I know you like to think that you are really smart and we can't actually tell when you're plagiarizing, but we know what your writing looks like. And if your sentence structure changes and how you present and organize sentences and phrases changes, we know that's not your own words. And also, what's really missing here is your parentheses, where you're actually putting in the credit where the credit is due here. Now, I want to show you another example of plagiarism, and it's in this particular quote. This is another example of plagiarism and paraphrasing. Now the reason why, because I know what you're saying, you're like, whoa, here, Mr. Muller. They cite the author, they cite the pages. Why is this still plagiarism? Well, if you notice, they're cherry picking certain phrases from that author. And it's actually highlighted here in the green. It's up here, it's in this statement, it's right here, it's right here, it's right here. They're actually using words from the source they're getting it from. You cannot do that. If you're paraphrasing, you have to represent the idea of the author in what you're saying. If you're starting to use their words, it's no longer paraphrasing, you're plagiarizing, because you're taking information directly from them and trying to pass it off as your own as a summary, when honestly, this paraphrasing is not representing the ideas of the author, it is the author's ideas. So you have to think about how you're presenting your information and how you're citing these in your argument. Now, here's a great rule. If you're referring to an idea, just making a brief reference to an idea that an author had, that's when you paraphrase, because you're not going to fall into the trap of using their own language if you're just referencing the idea or referencing the fact. That's when you use paraphrasing. When I've read a lot of educational, professional journal articles, what they'll do in paraphrasing is saying, the work of blank and blank did this, or they're supporting the idea, or they're saying, you know, as I was looking at the effectiveness of group assessments over individual assessments, the idea of making sure that there's an individual and a group component comes from blank. So you're not taking their words, you're just saying, hey, these people kind of pioneered the ideas that I started to work with. But you're referencing the ideas, you're not taking their information, you're just referencing them. When you're putting in quotes, make sure that the quotes you use either conveys something that's very memorable, a very important main idea, or conveys the character of the actual source. Now, I always say quotes are much better than paraphrases. You're not really going to drive home a point as effectively if you paraphrase instead of quote. Again, paraphrase if you're going to reference an idea or a fact. Now, here's some notes about quotes. I like that little rhyming phrase here. When you're using quotes in an argumentative paper, try not to use long ones, because first off, it gives me the impression that you can't successfully synthesize information, and it also seems like you're just trying to pad your paper with long quotes so that you don't really have to write a lot of your own ideas. So unless it's something spectacular, you really want to limit how many long quotes that you're using there. Make sure that the quote relates directly to your claim and your reasons. Make sure it all flows. If it's saying something different, or if it's focusing on something different than what you're trying to argue, your credibility gets shot in the paper, and it tells me you really can't use quotes and sources effectively. Make sure they're properly cited. Make sure that if the quote is grammatically incorrect, if it should have a plural or if it should have an apostrophe, you're going to insert a bracket. Brackets look like this, and you're going to put in the correction. So that way I know, okay, you altered the quote, but only so that it is grammatically correct. Now, what I would suggest you do is, after you write this, read out your paper and make sure you read out the quotes. It should be smooth. It shouldn't be disjointed or fragmented. Everything should flow smoothly in the argument that you're making. Now, a note about block quotes. These are the long, direct quotes. You want to try to limit them, but sometimes you want to include them because they're just a really, really good point. Usually in MLA, that is a quote that has more than 4 lines in your paper. Now, what you do is you indent the entire quote. You hit your tab button and you just shift it in. In the quote, you do not put quotation marks in the beginning and end of that block quote. However, if there is a quote inside the quote, then you give it double quotation marks. At the end of the block quote, you put in your parentheses, you put in the page number, the author, you put a period in, and then you keep going with a new paragraph and make sure that the rest of your argument's not indented. Now again, you want to limit those, but that is something that I had drilled into my head also by my history professors, because when you write history papers, sometimes you're going to have longer quotes because they're really going to help you out. Now, notes about introductions. Now, we have talked about this in previous videos, so I'm not going to go too much into more depth on this, but as you're doing the introduction, don't drag it out. I used to do this all the time with papers. I would just set the scene, and it'd be 2 pages long of an introduction, and by the time you actually get to your thesis, your claim, and you actually get to your argument, your reasons and evidence, I'm already bored. Start off fast. Let me feel like what you're talking about is important. Something is at stake, that if I don't read this and you don't try to convince me of this argument, then something is going to happen that might not be good. Give me some background information. If I'm a reader who knows nothing about the death penalty, then you need to tell me about why the death penalty is controversial. Dramatize the problem a little bit. Make me concerned, and state your thesis early on. Sometimes, and I know we have some English teachers who say do it at the end, you could also do it early. There's nothing necessarily wrong with putting your thesis at the end, but if I can read this earlier rather than later, I can have that in my head as I'm looking through the rest of your argument. Now, here are some guidelines for a strong conclusion, and again, we've gone through this in another video, so I'm not going to go too in depth. What you don't do in a conclusion is restate your thesis, restate your reasons, and then you just end it. That's actually incorrect. If your argument was good, then you shouldn't have to restate anything for me. It should still be in my head. So what you do is just leave me with something provocative. Tell me a story. Give me a call to action. Make me feel like I should want to do something or call someone or think something. Make sure that your conclusion connects back to your thesis, but you're not repeating it. Make just sure that if I read the introduction and the conclusion, I can see the same main ideas here. Now, give me a strong concluding image. Tell me a story. Give me an example. Tell me what's at stake. Give me a question to think about. Give me a call to action. Make me do something, because what you want me to do is think about something by the time this is over. I don't want to be bored and say, all right, let's move on to the next one. You should make me want to sit back and really think about, I really should do something, or I really need to think about this, or your perspective really made me consider something I didn't know before. That's when you know you have a strong conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all there is for today. Hope you learned something you did not know before. Thanks for watching.